a Cadillac is kind of like the American dream, right? We're trying to achieve a certain level of success. And once you achieve that level of success, then you go out and buy your Cadillac, right? And so this was that kind of look at ourselves, and the reason they're half buried and they're aimed downward is because we're realizing in the 1960s that that American dream isn't for everyone. Hi, my name is Chad Pollpeter. I'm an artist that's going to be participating in this show that Brad Biggs has put on, 60 through 69, a celebration of the 1960s. So when I was thinking about this show and trying to come up with a concept, I really had to kind of think about the 1960s and the fact that I do think it's a pretty prominent decade in our country's history. And then I started thinking a little bit more about it, and I kind of want to backtrack a little bit and talk about where our country came from a few years before the 60s, and then where it got to and what happened in the 60s. So we kind of were, back in the 40s, we ended up in World War II. And we ended up kind of going over there and then being involved in World War II, and then people felt really good about ourselves as far as Americans, because we kind of went over there and saved the world, if you will. And then we got into the 1950s and everything was like, all the soldiers came back, people were having babies. It looked like this kind of Leave It to Beaver type of society with, mom at home raising the kids, 2-car garage, everything was good. But then when we got to the 60s, things started to kind of turn a little bit. Our country had to kind of take an inner look at themselves as well as an outer look. So when you had the 50s and everything seemed really nice, it seemed really nice if you were kind of like a white suburban family. But if you're a person of color or a woman, then maybe things weren't as great as they should have been or could have been. This brings to mind a really famous artistic sculpture called the Cadillac Ranch, which is along Route 66, in which these artists from San Francisco got some sponsorship, and they took all these different types of Cadillacs and they buried them halfway into the ground that you can see along the road, right? And this was done in 1964. I think this was a prominent thing that happened, and the statement that it made, in my opinion, is the fact that a Cadillac is kind of like the American dream, right? We're trying to achieve a certain level of success. And once you achieve that level of success, then you go out and buy your Cadillac, right? And so this was that kind of look at ourselves, and the reason they're half buried and they're aimed downward is because we're realizing in the 1960s that that American dream isn't for everyone. So I think that is a really kind of prominent sculpture and work of art that kind of epitomizes what was happening in the 60s. You had a lot of turmoil that was going on. You had the civil rights movement that was happening. You had music that was changing. Even if you just look at the Beatles and just like their first showing on the Ed Sullivan Show, they're all in these nice suits, a little bit more conservative looking, and then you look at their evolution throughout the rest of the 60s and how they get into Sgt. Pepper and the psychedelics and this whole kind of peace and love and flower power. So there was just a lot of different things that were going on. There was a lot of violence that was happening with the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. You had the shooting of students at Kent State University, and then you even had the Charles Manson family and the Tate murders going on. So you had this whole kind of dichotomy of what was going on. Protests for the Vietnam War, that was all happening. And then you also had this kind of crazy outward kind of exploration of space, right? We were in this space race with the Russians. And I think that was a good sense of American pride. So we had this kind of dichotomy of science and being prideful of what we were doing with the space race and reaching the moon. I mean, it's crazy to think of the fact that the first flight of the Wright brothers was in 1903, and 66 years later, in 1969, we're landing on the moon. So I just think it was a really kind of crazy but important decade in our American history. So what I tried to do is, with my artwork here, this is called Cosmic Bloom. And this is basically a representation of Ed White and the first spacewalk, which was done in 1965, 60 years ago in June. So it was this summer. And then I kind of combined it with all the different cords and stuff that he's attached to for oxygen and things he needs to survive in space. I kind of had that blooming with all the different flowers to kind of represent that kind of psychedelic look of what was kind of also very apparent in the artwork and the look of style for that time frame. So hopefully you come out for the third Thursday in September at City Arts, and you can enjoy this exhibition, a celebration of the 1960s.